This is a system failure at the interface layer. Friday night, this whole Washington matrix just overloaded. Trump hit the terminate button on a policy, TPS for Somalis in Minnesota, and the ripple effect is a geometric explosion. The stated reason? Massive, multi-hundred-million-dollar welfare fraud being rerouted overseas, allegedly funding groups like Al-Shabaab. The unspoken target? Ilhan Omar's district. Pure, concentrated political optics. It's a precision strike, but the real story is the debug process. Why did this fraud, this glitch, get so massive in the first place? And why did this shutdown trigger the absolute chaos we're seeing right now in Congress? It's because this isn't just about Minnesota or Omar. It connects directly to my team's attempt to fix the back end, the colossal, bureaucratic mess of federal oversight. This is the moment the deep state's operating system crashed. The flow of funds, the political vulnerability, the targeting of a key figure, it all aligns. They let the glitch get huge, and now the president uses it as a tactical nuclear weapon. The spiral isn't just political, it's structural. The system is failing, and this single action is exposing the entire architecture. The detonation has begun. It was 8:41 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, November 28th, 2025. I saw the alert pop up on my feed, a President Trump post. Short, aggressive, maximum impact. Immediate termination of temporary protected status, TPS, for Somali migrants specifically in Minnesota. My initial thought was maximum leverage, minimum legal surface area. The official rationale was a direct, devastating indictment of systemic failure. Minnesota as a hub of fraudulent money laundering activity with billions of dollars are missing. Hyperbole, maybe, but the core data is solid. The political calculus is flawless, hitting Ilhan Omar where she lives, weaponizing a genuine, massive system exploit against her entire constituency. This isn't statesmanship, it's a political denial of service attack. The immediate reaction from the established political structures was predictable, immediate entropy. Legal experts pointed out the dubious authority. TPS is a federal, country-level designation, not a state-level one. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison started firing off legal threats. But the president achieved the primary objective: inject maximum uncertainty and political toxicity into the core of the opposition's power base. The 75,000 to 85,000 strong Somali community in Minnesota, while mostly citizens, are now suddenly viewed through the lens of a $300 million fraud/terror funding pipeline. Omar's response, "We are here to stay," was required, but it missed the real point. The president wasn't trying to physically deport 80,000 people overnight. He was trying to politically deport her. He nationalized a local vulnerability and branded it. Let's look at the underlying mechanics, which is what actually matters. My team and I have been looking at the federal bureaucracy for months, trying to implement something approximating efficiency, a genuine digital transformation. The Minnesota fraud case is a perfect, grotesque microcosm of the entire problem. We're talking multiple, coordinated scams that drain taxpayer funds through programs meant for the most vulnerable: children's meals, disability support, housing for the elderly. Estimates place the total loss at $250 million to $300 million, a staggering amount of capital diverted from the critical path. The oversight mechanism, the entire state apparatus designed to audit and verify these funds, simply collapsed. It was overwhelmed by the sheer, fraudulent volume. The system wasn't just exploited, it was out-executed by the criminals. But the most critical vulnerability, the fatal error, was the financial vector. Federal reports confirm the money didn't just stay in Minneapolis. Large amounts were channeled overseas via informal remittance systems, eventually filtering into territories controlled by Al-Shabaab in Somalia. This isn't just welfare fraud, it's a national security vulnerability. It means the U.S. taxpayer was inadvertently subsidizing a terrorist group. This single data point is the justification for the presidential action. It's the ultimate ethical dilemma wrapped in a political advantage, stopping terror funding while eliminating a high-profile political rival's foundation. It's brutal, but it's effective. The congressional reaction was the second stage of the detonation. House Democrats launched an inquiry, framed as a defense of civil liberties. But the Republican-controlled House Speaker immediately suppressed the resolution, effectively giving the action a tacit green light and maximizing the political pain on the Democrats. This forces the entire party into a lose-lose dynamic. Defend Omar and risk being painted as soft on fraud and terror funding, or abandon her and expose the deep, ideological fracture within the Democratic coalition. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a strategically executed ambush designed to destabilize the entire opposition infrastructure before the 2026 cycle. And the next piece of this chaotic sequence, the collapse of a major agency overhaul, is where my own experience with Washington's systemic rot becomes the defining variable. The system fights back. Is this Minnesota move a justified response to terror funding, or just a calculated attack on political opponents? What do you think the real endgame is here? Let me know in the comments. If you want to understand why Trump's Minnesota move worked so well, why it created such a massive pressure wave in Washington, you have to look at the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. Or, rather, the smoking crater where DOGE used to be. I was brought in to do a full-stack, kernel-level re-engineering of the federal bureaucracy. The brief: eliminate fraud, waste, and abuse, FWA. That means installing a zero-trust model onto a system that was built on 1950s trust assumptions. This wasn't about trimming the fat. It was about rewriting the entire code. The Minnesota fraud, $300 million plus, flowing to Al-Shabaab. That was the perfect proof of concept for the scale of the failure. It was the bug in the system everyone was ignoring, but it was just one node. We hit the ground running. Initial results were astronomical. We were canceling contracts with no discernible deliverable, billions in ceiling value that had simply been feeding consultants and incumbents for decades. We targeted programs with explosive, unverified growth, like the Housing Stabilization Services, HSS, in Minnesota, which ballooned from a $2.6 million estimate to a $61 million payout in 6 months in 2025, just before the state tried to scrap it. This is exponential corruption. But the bureaucracy has its own immune system, and it is optimized for inertia, not innovation. The real Washington power structure, the lobby firms, the lifetime civil service, the entrenched congressional committee chairs, they don't make money from efficiency. They make money from complexity and unchecked spending. When DOGE started pulling the wires, the system violently rejected the new hardware. The pushback was relentless. Every reported saving was scrutinized, analyzed, and publicly dismantled by think tanks funded by the very defense contractors and consultants whose contracts we were terminating. Our initial goal of cutting $2 trillion in the first year was mathematically possible, but politically impossible. The target kept shrinking, $1 trillion, then $150 billion, as political friction burned off our momentum. The deep state wasn't fighting us with logic. It was fighting us with paperwork and reputation assassination. They used the complexity we were trying to eliminate as a weapon against us. The final rupture came in May 2025. It wasn't a policy failure. It was a political one. Tensions with the president, who needed quick, splashy wins, collided with my insistence on a deep, slow structural fix. The press, amplified by the institutions we were disrupting, painted the project as an error-filled window and rash destruction. They hated the zero-trust principle, that every dollar, every process, every person must be continuously verified. They wanted the old system where trust was granted by title, not performance. The media spin became the dominant reality. I stepped away in May, and the Doge deorbit was immediate and catastrophic. The team, mostly high-velocity engineers and tech-focused executives, scattered. Morale flatlined. The remnants of the department became rudderless. Key reforms, like the implementation of an AI-driven, real-time audit protocol for all federal grant disbursements, were instantly mothballed by the incoming political appointees who favor the old, human-driven, exploitable process. The system won. So, fast forward to November 28, 2025. Trump's TPS termination is announced. What he did was take the single largest, most undeniable failure point that Doge had validated, the Minnesota fraud, and use it as a cudgel, a political weapon. He is effectively saying, see, the system is broken, and the only way to fix it is through brute force executive action, not through Musk's complex, zero-trust re-engineering. The political narrative is simple and effective, action over process. This is where the political ambush of Ilhan Omar becomes a critical function in the larger power shift. By targeting her district using the data Doge helped uncover, the administration validated the corruption thesis while simultaneously dismissing the need for a long-term, systemic fix. They used the evidence of failure to justify a political attack, which in turn justified the continuation of a system that is inherently vulnerable to this exact kind of fraud. It's a closed, cynical loop, and the power brokers in Washington, who breathe the air of complexity, breathe the collective sigh of relief because the one thing that could have disrupted their revenue stream, Doge, was finally confirmed dead. The stage is now set for the next phase of the political demolition. Was the failure of Doge an inevitable bureaucratic resistance, or did Elon Musk underestimate the complexity of a government rewrite? Let me know in the comments below. The system is inherently asymmetrical. One side initiates the attack, Trump with the executive action, and the other side, the resistance, is forced to react. This is where Ilhan Omar, often dismissed as a purely ideological figure, showed her true operational resilience. She didn't just fire back with moral outrage. She initiated a tactical counterstrike that targeted the legal and data vulnerabilities of the president's own rationale. The president's move was simple: use undeniable fraud data, the $300 million to Al-Shabaab vector that Doge had validated, to justify a politically charged action, TPS termination. Omar's response was a classic legal jujitsu maneuver. First, she immediately highlighted the core legal weakness. The president cannot, legally, terminate a nationwide TPS designation for only one state. Immigration law experts agree, and she made this the central, non-negotiable narrative. This reduces the executive action from a policy change to a performance, art legal bluff. But the real threat to the administration isn't the legal challenge. It's the shift in the data narrative. Omar and her allies, including State Attorney General Keith Ellison, didn't deny the fraud. That's a losing battle because the numbers, $250M, Al-Shabaab, are too big and too real. Instead, they performed a pivot. The fraud is the state's failure, not the community's crime. They seized on the data that Doge had also uncovered, the state-level failure of oversight, the bureaucratic negligence that allowed the Feeding Our Future and autism treatment schemes to metastasize for years. They pivoted the blame from the immigrant community to the Governor Walz administration and the long-entrenched state agencies. This is critical. By framing the problem as systemic negligence, Omar achieves three goals simultaneously. Shields the community. She isolates the criminal network, the few, from the general Somali population, the many, transforming them from political targets into victims of state malfeasance. Splits the opposition. She throws the bomb back into the lap of the Democratic Farmer Labor, DFL, state leadership in Minnesota, creating a brutal public rift between the progressive wing, her base, and the establishment wing, Walz, and the state apparatus. This fragmentation is a major win for her in local politics, as it positions her as the true outsider fighting corruption at every level, including her own parties. Reframes the national security risk. She argues that the real danger to national security wasn't TPS, but the lack of a modern, competent audit system. This is a perfect callback to the very zero-trust argument I was making at Doge, that without a digital firewall, the system is an open spigot for hostile foreign financing. Omar and her team immediately filed a FOIA-based demand for all state and federal communications between the governor's office, the State Department of Human Services, DHS, and federal agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, federal, and the FBI regarding the fraud alerts from 2020 through 2023. They are looking for the smoking gun that proves willful negligence, or, even better, a deliberate political soft-pedaling of the warnings to protect the DFL's political coalition. This is the key to understanding the political spiral. Omar is using the high-level data that initially targeted her to launch a mid-level attack on the bureaucracy that failed to implement the zero-trust principles I advocated for. She is effectively arguing that the massive fraud that justified Trump's attack on her district was caused by the same bureaucratic incompetence that suffocated my effort at Doge. It's a remarkably effective rhetorical loop. The old system, the bureaucracy, created the vulnerability, the fraud, that the president used to attack the new politics, Omar. The political implication for Washington is huge. It means the focus shifts instantly from immigrants are corrupt to is the Minnesota state government complicit in funding terrorism? This recenters the debate on the incompetence of the entrenched political class, a theme that resonates deeply with the public. It also forces the National Democratic Party to decide who they will back, the popular local progressive, Omar, or the compromised state establishment, Walz. The next phase of the spiral will involve the inevitable media-feeding frenzy and the weaponization of the released documents. The information Omar is seeking is the same information I was trying to programmatically eliminate the need for: proof of human failure in the oversight process. While the president's move was an effective political ambush on a community, Omar's counterstrike is a technical deconstruction of the administration's premise, using the failure of the system itself as the primary evidence. It's an asymmetric information war, and she just acquired better targeting coordinates. By turning the fraud investigation back onto the state government, is Ilhan Omar acting as a true anti-corruption agent, or is this just a political survival move? Let me know in the comments below. The tactical response by Representative Ilhan Omar, shifting the core narrative away from the immigrant community and onto the state bureaucracy, has created a full-blown political catastrophe for Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. He's trying to manage an existential crisis where he has no winning move. He must defend his administration's competence while simultaneously placating his own party's progressive base, which is now aligned with Omar's charge of institutional negligence. The governor is effectively pinned between the federal pressure applied by the president and the informational pressure applied by a key political rival. The governor's public defense has been a display of controlled chaos, attempting to show action over accountability. He highlighted his administration's late-stage anti-fraud measures, the creation of a centralized fraud unit, and the introduction of proposals for using AI in detection. The problem is timing. These defensive measures were implemented after the massive fraud, the $250 million Feeding Our Future scheme, and the spiraling Housing Stabilization Services, HSS, fraud, had already occurred and been exposed. He is trying to close the barn door with a public relations campaign, but the taxpayer money has already flown the coop. The political cost is immense for a governor contemplating a bid for a third term, as the narrative of oversight failure now colors his entire record. The information war took a decisive turn when documents surfaced following Omar's aggressive demands for federal and state communications. These files, initially leaked and then officially acknowledged, revealed not a criminal conspiracy within the Walz administration, but something far more endemic and typically bureaucratic. Willful institutional inertia and a political paralysis fueled by fear. The key data points from the internal state records were devastating. Auditor warnings dismissed. Internal memos from the Minnesota Department of Human Services, DHS, analysts, dating back as far as 2020, showed repeated, urgent warnings regarding the exponential, unverifiable growth of certain social service programs. The HSS program, which was a primary vehicle for the fraud, was projected to cost $2.6 million annually, but was paying out over $60 million in just the first 6 months of 2025 alone before the state finally moved to halt payments. The internal auditors flagged the payment volume as mathematically impossible to verify given the state's manual, outdated oversight systems. Yet, DHS leadership consistently delayed aggressive intervention. The fear was simple. Shutting down high-growth programs meant for vulnerable populations would invite accusations of xenophobia and racism, politically damaging the DFL coalition. They chose political risk mitigation over fiduciary duty, downplaying the scale to feds. Early communications logs indicated a deliberate soft-pedaling of the crisis when dealing with federal agencies like the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. State officials repeatedly characterized the problem as complex compliance issues or mismanagement rather than an organized, multi-state fraud network with international ties. This minimized the severity of the threat in federal channels, delaying the robust, centralized law enforcement response needed to track the money overseas effectively. This structural flaw, the state hiding its incompetence from the federal authority, is precisely the kind of systemic vulnerability my team at the former Department of Government Efficiency was trying to digitally eradicate with a zero-trust real-time audit protocol. The old system shielded its failure. The confirmed Hawala vector, the most damaging confirmation came from the data regarding the money's destination. While the president's allies had already run the story connecting the funds to Al-Shabaab, Omar's team used the state's own internal fraud unit reports from early 2023. These documents confirmed that state agencies were aware that Hawala networks, informal, often unmonitored money transfer systems popular in the Somali diaspora, were the primary conduit for the massive capital flight out of the state and the country. The state knew the mechanism and the scale of the hemorrhage, even if they hadn't publicly confirmed the final Al-Shabaab destination. Omar immediately leveraged this data to launch her highest-velocity public attack against the state establishment. Her narrative became laser-focused. The $300 million was lost not because of the community, but because of the governor's calculated inaction. She successfully framed the Walz administration as either grossly negligent or politically compromised, choosing to tolerate corruption rather than risk a progressive backlash by cracking down on providers within the community. This shattered the Democratic Farmer Labor, DFL, coalition in Minnesota. The progressive wing is now armed with undeniable data to challenge the institutional DFL leadership, creating an internal war that saps the party's resources and validates the core charge of bureaucratic rot. For Washington, the consequences are immediate and far-reaching. The president's initial attack on temporary protected status, TPS, has been superseded by a much more powerful meta-narrative. The political left's embrace of identity politics led directly to a massive, nation-compromising financial fraud. The GOP no longer needs to win the dubious legal battle over TPS. They have successfully used the crisis to engineer a collapse of the internal opposition in a critical swing state. The Walz administration's firewall has not just cracked, it has failed, exposing the deep, structural flaws of the old, human-driven oversight model that I was fighting to replace. The chaos factor is now dominant, and the next move involves the national security state's inevitable intervention to fill the regulatory vacuum. Given the evidence of state negligence and the massive fraud, who bears the greater responsibility? The governor for the systemic failure or the federal government for failing to intervene sooner? Let me know in the comments below. Part 5. The National Security Vacuum and the Political Reset, December 15th, 2025, Elon Musk. The spiral inevitably concludes with the national security state moving to fill the power vacuum created by the political chaos. The president's termination of temporary protected status, TPS, regardless of its dubious legality or its pure political intent, has succeeded in triggering a massive reprioritization across the FBI, the Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, and the intelligence community. The headline, "Minnesota Taxpayer Dollars Fund Al-Shabaab," is too potent a national security threat to ignore. The focus is now shifting from the immigration status of a few hundred individuals to the illicit financial network that enabled the $300 million capital flight. This is where the Treasury Department and the FBI take the lead, bypassing the messy local politics and state bureaucracy that failed to act. The objective is clear: map the Hawala networks used to move the fraud money and, for the first time, potentially designate specific Minneapolis-based money transfer operators as terrorist finance conduits, triggering devastating sanctions that freeze their assets and cut them off from the global financial system. This intervention is the political reset for Ilhan Omar. By exposing the Walz administration's failures, she validated the core, finding that a massive financial vulnerability exists. Now, as the federal security apparatus descends, she pivots from being the target of the attack to the local advocate for a secure, accountable system. She can leverage the public records her team forced into the open to demand federal action, not just against the immigrant community, but against the financial conduits that exploited the poor oversight. Her position becomes: the federal government needs to stop playing politics with TPS and start using its real power to stop the flow of terror money by sanctioning the guilty parties, regardless of political consequence. However, this national security intervention also poses a massive risk to Omar's progressive base. The tools used by OFAC and the FBI, sanctions, asset forfeiture, broad counterterrorism financing statutes, are blunt instruments. They are designed for speed and severity, not local political nuance. If the federal agencies blanket sanction Minneapolis-based remittance networks, it could collapse the legitimate financial lifeline for thousands of law-abiding Somali Americans who rely on those systems to send money to family overseas. This would confirm the president's narrative of collective punishment through unintended consequence, turning a local political victory for Omar into a humanitarian and economic disaster for her constituents. The ultimate political fallout of this entire sequence is the complete re-engineering of the Minnesota political map for 2026. While the federal security intervention successfully stopped the money laundering without causing mass economic distress to the legitimate Somali community? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.